from Oklahoma yield to him because he and I had been discussing this idea of the President's responsibility to enforce border security and enforce laws related to immigration. So I'll yield you as much time as you consume so that you can discuss that.
Well, I appreciate that. And it's perfectly appropriate that we have the gentleman here from Arizona as well. The gentleman from Arizona, you know, when you serve in this body, you get to meet a lot of very interesting people that have done amazing things in their lives. And the gentleman from Arizona who we heard from earlier had an opportunity to serve in this body back in the 90s. And then he left. He had a term limit pledge, and he honored his term limit pledge. And then he came back recently as a newly elected freshman with the rest of us, and it's an honor to serve with him. But interestingly, in that hiatus, when he was back in Arizona, he ran for the governorship of Arizona, and he darn near won. And interestingly, he ran against the person who won was Janet Napolitano, who became Secretary of Homeland Security here in the Obama administration. And here I'd like to discuss some things, why it's so important for me personally. I'm a Navy pilot, as the gentleman from Florida said, and I've flown combat. But interestingly, I've also flown counter-drug missions in Central and South America. And I can tell you without a doubt that the drug cartels that we fight down in Central and South America, they don't try to get the drugs into the United States of America anymore. Their only objective is to get the drugs to northern Mexico, where they are vertically integrated with gangs and other cartels who bring the drugs across the border without a hitch. Now, because we have these drug wars in northern Mexico, by the way, there are over 100,000 people that have been killed in the last 7 years in these drug wars in northern Mexico, but that exists because we have an open border policy on the south side of the United States. So if you were to hand a 16-year-old kid a backpack with $1 million worth of cocaine, and you say to him, hey, go across this border, get to that point, and you're going to be very well rewarded. 16-year-old kid will do that in many cases in these impoverished areas in northern Mexico. Interestingly, another 16-year-old kid will see that backpack and want it for himself. And the next thing you know, you've got one killing the other. And then you get a third killing the second. And then you have these gangs form. And this is how you get to a point where you have cartels and gangs that are killing not only each other, 100,000 people, but they're also killing judges, they're killing police officers, they're killing politicians, and on top of it all, they're not just transporting cocaine. They're transporting young girls in the slave trade. They're transporting weapons. And this is happening in northern Mexico, just south of our border. Northern Mexico is on the brink of a failed state because of this, and it's a direct result of an open border policy. Now, Secretary of Homeland Security, former Secretary of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, has been on record. What does she say? She says that the border is secure. That's what she says. And I've just got to tell you that I know firsthand that it's not. And the people who live in Arizona know that it's not. The people who live in Texas know that it's not. The border is not secure. But here's what we've done in this body. We have passed laws to secure the border. Has the border become secure? No. Have thousands of people died since those laws have been passed because we haven't secured the border? Yes. The President's job, per the Constitution, is to faithfully execute the laws, not pick and choose which laws he wants to follow based on political preference, which is what he has been doing. So if it's all right, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Arizona. You've been near and dear to this for a very long time, and if you have some comments, I'd love to have you share.
I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma, and yes, it's been something we've been dealing with in a very up-close and personal way. In fact, about a month and a half ago, I had the good fortune to meet with Arizona's Adjutant General. He's over the National Guard for Arizona. He was finishing up his term in office, and I said, sir, what is your biggest concern when it comes to possible terrorist activity here in Arizona? You know, we don't have a lot of the national weather pattern problems like they do in other parts of the country, hurricanes like in Florida. We don't have earthquakes. We have a dust storm every now and then, way too many of them, and we've had some terrible fires. But I was truly interested. I wasn't trying to lead him in any direction, and he said, without a doubt, the thing that keeps me up at night, the thing that worries me more than anything, is the porousness of our border and the fact that about 15% of the people that we apprehended last year were not from Mexico. Many of those people were from the Middle East. What I worry about is because it is so lax and so easy to get across our border that some terrorist is going to be able to get across the border with a suitcase bomb and detonate it, and a lot of people are going to be injured or killed. That was his big concern. So then I had an opportunity to sit down with some of our ICE people that are stationed in Arizona. They're the ones that are responsible for interior enforcement. And I had a long conversation with them. And you know what they told me? They said, you know, we don't really need a lot more assets to get the border secured. What we need is for this administration to enforce the law. We need them to let us do our jobs. We're law enforcement people. We see the law very, very clearly. We know what the law states, but our hands have been tied by this administration. They won't let us do our jobs. He then proceeded to tell me that we've done these surveys on a regular basis to try to determine where employee morale is at. And they said that it's at an all-time low ever since they've been doing these surveys right now within ICE, especially in Arizona, because they feel like they're not empowered to do their jobs, and they wonder, what am I doing here? Many of them want to be transferred out or just kind of, you know, march in place and do their time and get out as soon as they possibly can. But the morale is terrible. These are honorable, decent people that want to do their jobs. And the other side would have you believe, no, this is just about some honest people that want to come across the border and get jobs in the United States and take care of their families. It's not just about that. As we saw with Brian Terry, with the gun smuggling, Fast and Furious. Guns are being smuggled across the border. Drugs are being smuggled across the border. And unsavory characters who have bad ideas on what they want to do with the United States are coming across the border. And one day, the piper's going to have to be paid. And so the border is far from being secure. We have the ability to do it, but this administration will not let them do their jobs. I yield back.
Well, thank you for that. And it's interesting, as you bring up former Secretary Napolitano brings up the presidential appointment and confirmation process. And the Constitution provides for a cabinet officer, judges, that they go. President will nominate, the Senate votes, advise and consent to confirm, and then at that point they can become appointed and fill up the office. There's also another provision in Article 2 of the Constitution, Section 2, involving what are called recess appointments, and it says the President shall have power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session. And so this made a lot of sense at the time, especially because you'd be in session, people live from all over the country, and they horse-drawn carriage to get to Washington or back. So the Senate may be out for months and months, and founders didn't want government ground to a halt. It's been used more recently if the Senate's on a recess. President can kind of strategically figure that out and appoint somebody who may not otherwise be able to be confirmed. But what this president did is a step further than that. He actually said that if the Senate says that it's not in recess, if they're just adjourned for, say, a day, a couple days, and they're having pro forma session, that doesn't actually count as a recess in his judgment, and that he can go ahead and do recess appointments, people to the National Labor Relations Board and the Consumer Financial Protection Board that would not otherwise be able to be confirmed. And a lot of people cried foul about this, excuse me, and it actually got tied up in the courts. And normally we have to check some of these things, but there's somebody who had standing to bring a lawsuit. It's gone to 2 different Circuit Court of Appeals, and they both said, look, the President can't just unilaterally determine when the Senate's in recess. The Senate's either in recess or they're not. If it's just that they go to sleep at night and come back the next morning, the President can't wait till midnight and just thrust somebody into office. So both of those courts have said that the President overstepped his authority by shoving these recess appointments in office. while the Senate was still not in a formal recess. They were just adjourned within that term of service. And so I think the Supreme Court is going to hear that this time, and I think that they're definitely very likely to agree with those courts and say if the President can determine when it's a recess, then the whole idea of advise and consent gets swallowed up by the exception, and that's just not something that's going to work. The gentleman from Arizona is interesting with his history, because I listed some major pieces of legislation and how they all got broad bipartisan support. The last one I mentioned was the 1996 Welfare Reform Act that Congress basically passed. It got vetoed, passed again. Finally, President Clinton signed it. And the core of that, as I understand it, was that you'd actually try to incentivize work instead of dependency, so you actually had work requirements for able-bodied folks. And I think the results of that were very, very positive. It essentially changed the incentive structure and actually gave people hope to get off dependency and into a productive life. So I'll yield to the gentleman from Arizona, because the President has basically watered down those work requirements unilaterally, and I think that that'll have a negative effect. So I yield to the gentleman from Arizona.
I thank the gentleman from Florida. Yes, I was right in the middle of all of those debates. In fact, before I came to Congress, the Arizona legislature, which I was part of, actually passed a bill called Workfare, which was very similar to what we passed in 1996. And it recognizes the idea, I think the truth, that government, while it can, there's an old Chinese proverb, if I catch a fish for you, you'll have food for today. If I teach you to fish, you'll have food for your life. And that was the model that we tried to employ, and that was that people have to work. They have to give something back for the welfare payments that they're given. It was called Workfare, and that was what we decided to do here in the Congress. And it did one other thing, Congressman, that no government program can or normally does really do, and that's help instill dignity in people. I think one of the things that has really broken our country is that we've become this welfare state, a bunch of dependents across the country, and I think that giving somebody the opportunity to be able to give something back actually helps preserve, I think, the human spirit. We all want to feel like we have some worth, that we have some relevance in society. And the old traditional welfare program is almost like, we'll pay you to stay out of society. We'll give you just barely enough to subsist, but you stay out of society. And that's the message, subliminally or otherwise, that it gives to those people. We don't really have much value for you. You don't offer much value to society, so we'll pay you to just stay home. Well, we thought of a different idea. I think a vastly more compassionate idea. And that is to be able to have people give something back, so they didn't get something for nothing. And also, along the way, they actually got skills and abilities that they didn't otherwise have, so that they could learn how to work. They could learn how to hold down a job. And so that was one of the key components of the welfare reform that we passed in '96, that while we send that money out to the states, that there are work requirements. And I think that's reasonable. You don't get something for nothing. You've got to get out and help pull the wagon instead of having everybody cart you around. That's reasonable. And what did this president do? The moment he got in office, he started through executive order, granting waivers to each of the states, getting rid of those work requirements. Again, that was a law that was passed in '96, signed by President Clinton, and a president coming after changes the terms of those laws. To me, as far as I'm concerned, not only is that lawless, but it's foolish, because it's hurting the very people that he purports to help, and I believe that rather than helping them, it's keeping them down. I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Arizona for that. And it's interesting. You mentioned just as the president came into office, and I remember the first thing, and I wasn't here, none of us were in Congress at the time, just as a citizen. I was active duty Navy, you were probably too, Mr. Bridenstine, but we had this stimulus bill that had been passed, and this was a huge thing. And part of that, as I've learned more about it, is that there were actually requirements that the executive branch was supposed to submit timely reports that would document the different spending and what was going on. And I think even the Vice President said, hey, I'm going to be the watchdog on this. And it is, in fact, the case that most of those deadlines have just been completely disregarded, that you haven't seen the type of reporting that was envisioned by the law, and that's perhaps because the law wasn't successful at engineering an economic recovery. Shortly after that, though, one of the biggest issues that happened, this is 2009, was the auto bankruptcy. And this was something that was unusual because the White House actually got very much involved on the ground in terms of refereeing the rights of the various parties, including the creditors. And so I'll yield some time to the gentleman from Oklahoma to discuss that, because you had mentioned that was something that had bothered you at the time. And so the floor is yours.
Well, I appreciate that. You know, when we talk about the rule of law means that it applies equally to everyone. And of course, today we have talked a lot about how within Obamacare the rule of law does not apply equally to everyone. Some people get waivers depending on what kind of company you work for. Some companies get waivers. Some unions get waivers when it comes to individual health care policies. Some people get grandfathered and they get to keep their policy. Other people get letters saying that their policy is canceled. So we have exchanged in this country at this point under Obamacare, we've exchanged the rule of law for the rule of man, where you have nameless, faceless bureaucrats that they don't represent anybody, that make decisions that change the law for individuals. And that's not what was intended by the Founding Fathers. When you think about, as the gentleman from Florida said, when you think about creditor rights, and you think about the bailout for Chrysler, you have different classes of creditors. In the case of the Chrysler bailout, you had secured creditors. That means that in the hierarchy structure, they were superior to the shareholders. They were superior because they were lending the money. They weren't the owners of the company. They were lending the money. They had rights that were above the shareholders. And in the case of Chrysler, what happened is the president came in, like you said, and they got very involved and, in fact, changed the rule of law for the rule of man, where you had bureaucrats coming in and making a decision that the secured creditors would be wiped out. In fact, they were bullied. I think they received 30 cents on a dollar for investment, if I remember correctly. But the secured creditors would be bullied to give up their investment, and the people who actually came out ahead were the unions, who were not secured creditors. And this is a violation of bankruptcy law. I mean, the president's job, again, is to faithfully execute the law, not change the law for political preference, not change the law, not replace the rule of law with the rule of man, which is what they did in this case. And politically, they made a decision that the secured creditors would be wiped out, the unions would be made whole, and at the end of the day, here's the fallout from that. In the United States of America, all across this country, and in the world, people are making decisions about where they're going to invest money. And if you look at the investment opportunities in the United States of America right now, if you're going to invest in big business, the whole too big to fail mantra that we've heard over and over again, if you're going to invest in big business, you're going to have to take a risk. And that risk has nothing to do with the return on investment or whether or not the company is sound. That risk is now political risk. Because as an investor, politically, you could be wiped out, even if you have a secured debt instrument. And when you replace the rule of law with the rule of man, especially as it relates to business, people make decisions to invest elsewhere. And if you look at our country right now, and you look at the capital investment in our country, we could be doing much better. And of course, if we had a president that adhered to the law, rather than changing the law based on political preference, we might see more investment in our country. And of course, investment is how businesses grow. It's how they raise money to open up a new plant or open up a new store. And capital investment is how new firms get created, and it's how jobs get created and grow. So what we have right now is the replacement of the rule of law for the rule of man, and it's been detrimental for our economy as it relates to the securities industry. And with that, I'd like to yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma. I thank both the gentleman from Oklahoma and the gentleman from Arizona for coming here today to offer their views. Their comments are much appreciated. And the great thing about these two guys is they'll stand up to people regardless of party. They'll stand up to people in their own party. They'll stand up to people in the other party if what they're trying to do is not the right thing, because these guys want to do the right thing. I just want to conclude by just invoking two giants in American history in terms of some of the issues that we've discussed today and kind of what they mean. And the first is the father of the country, George Washington. You know, when he took the reins as the first president of the United States, he made a comment that I walk on untrodden ground. And so he had a great sense that it wasn't just about him. He was already the biggest hero in the country. He could have taken over the country after defeating the British. He could have been king, but he surrendered his sword and retired to Mount Vernon until he was called back for further service. And he was very sensitive to the idea that he was trying to establish a framework for freedom that could last generations. And it wasn't just about his own personal glory. And what he tried to establish was the proper role of an executive in a constitutional system. There was a lot of people that said you either have a strong executive and it's a monarchy, or you just can't have a strong executive. And I think he laid the foundation to say actually you can have a constitutionally circumscribed executive power that was nevertheless a force for good for the country. And the other gentleman that I'd like to mention is Abraham Lincoln, who's obviously one of the greatest presidents we've ever had. His earliest recorded speech was a speech before the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois. This is in the 1830s, so he still had decades before he was president. I don't think he had been elected to anything, even locally at the time. And he was really concerned about the future of the country because he said we had this great revolution, you had this great Constitution, you had these wonderful decades where people were actually living and breathing that, and obviously he felt that there was a lot of work to do because he spoke out against things like slavery, but he thought that the ball was moving in the right direction in terms of individual freedom. But he feared that as the Founding Fathers and their generation passed away, that people really wouldn't have something that they could all have to organize around and be faithful to in terms of our country. And so what he told people to do was to really embrace constitutional principles and the rule of law. In this speech, he said, as the patriots of '76 did to support the Declaration of Independence, so too the support of the Constitution and laws. Let every American pledge his life, his property, and his sacred honor. Let every man remember that to violate the laws, to trample on the blood of his father, and to tear the charter of his own and his children's liberty. And he went on to say, in short, let it become the political religion of the nation, and let the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the grave and the gay of all sexes and tongues and colors and conditions sacrifice unceasingly upon its altars. And I think what Lincoln was getting at was this idea of American exceptionalism. It's not because we as Americans are anything I'm certainly not anything special. It's not that we're so much better than anybody as people. The exceptional part of the country is the origins of the country and the principles that the country is designed to further. And that, I think, is what Lincoln was talking about, that when you embrace the Declaration, when you embrace the Constitution, you're embracing a framework in which individual liberty is the paramount objective of society, and that is why things like the separation of powers, that is why you have to have proper lawfulness from the legislature and executive are so important. It's not just because this is all a game and we want to try to blow the whistle on people who are in the other party. It's because ultimately this constitutional structure and these protections are what make us different from all the countries that have come before and all the countries that have been founded since. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For a government that shuts down, there sure seems to be a great deal going on. Down here on the mall, we ended up, again, somehow the National Park Service, which has been, parenthetically speaking here, they have presided over a park service that, beginning with the Franklin D. Roosevelt Memorial, has not had God mentioned in any memorial since that time. We don't have time or place for mentioning God as our memorials have in some way in the past, but by golly, we got time during a shutdown to approve a permit to allow people who want to demand that, though they're here in this country illegally, they have a right to demand rights. And this administration, just as it did with the Occupy Washington movement, facilitates that. We know with the Occupy Washington movement there was all kinds of lewd, lascivious stuff going on in public. The Park Service didn't seem to be bothered by that, but let veterans show up to the World War II Memorial, and they've got barricades. Let World War II veterans who fought their way to the top of Mount Suribachi try to get to the monument that commemorates climbing to the top of Suribachi. They put up big obstacles to our veterans getting there. So the message from this administration very clearly is, if you're illegally in the country, we'll bend over backwards to let you commit all kinds of acts in the mall. We'll send Capitol Police down to pick up your garbage. If you just want to illegally occupy an area, a public area, we'll let you do that. We'll let you use the basis services in public. All kinds of lewd, lascivious things going on there with the Occupy Washington movement, and that was allowed to continue on and on and on. However, if you have served your country in the United States military, then we're going to try to make life miserable for you. There just might be those people that have hung on to their God and their guns and love America and love the Constitution, so this Homeland Security thinks you're a threat, which is quite interesting. You know, with all the things that are going on, we have seen that this administration has not had a problem with some things that some of us feel like are a problem. Like I've mentioned in the last couple of years about a member of what was originally the Countering Violent Extremism Working Group, had a gentleman named El-Biari from Texas that was placed on there. And then he got a promotion from Secretary Janet Napolitano up to Homeland Security Advisory Council. And, gee, now we're finding out he's continuing to defend one of the principles of the Holy Land Foundation. We're finding out that he is still defending, still considers them to be unjustly prosecuted, even though federal courts have found that crimes were committed, terrorism was supported by the Holy Land Foundation. Dallas Federal Court, along with the U.S. Court of Appeals in New Orleans, found that groups like CARE, which has now changed its name to WTF, and ISNA, groups like that were the largest front group for the Muslim Brotherhood in America. And so it's rather interesting because here we've made, this administration has made life so difficult for our veterans just trying to get here and enjoy the memorials. I've been down to the memorials, I think, every day until today, and you know, it's amazing. You know, I've been down there all days, all kind, different days, all hours of day and night. You're lucky if you see one park ranger in the area of the World War II memorial, and yet now they've got them very strategically placed. They will stand there with the barricades closed most of the time. If some group comes up and explains that they're a World War II veterans group, then they'll open and let them through, but they stand there intimidating. Sometimes an officer comes by with a K-9, which is a bit more intimidating to most people. So unless members of Congress are standing there, we see people come up and get intimidated, walk away, unless a member of Congress goes up and says, please come in, you are welcome. Fortunately, veterans of Vietnam and Korea are just going around the barricades and fortunately not being stopped. At the Lincoln Memorial, though, when a couple of members of Congress encouraged people to come on up like they do at the World War II Memorial, they said it appeared the park SWAT team. I mean, officers came in from all over threatening arrest, get out of here. It's just amazing how far this administration will go to hurt Americans that love America, that have served this country. And then we find out about Americans killed in Afghanistan. There should have been no problem whatsoever with the Defense Department cutting the $100,000 checks to these families. Should not have been. And if there was any doubt, then the bill we passed before the shutdown began should have taken care of that. There was plenty of prerogative to do that. But we had to come back today and pass another bill just to say, get a check to the families of those who lost a loved one serving this country. Because the administration is playing hardball and has gotten policies in place that are hurting as many Americans as possible. But when you look at who's advising this country's top leaders, it isn't any surprise. Here's a story from October the 6th from the Daily Caller. Senior advisor to the Department of Homeland Security is an old friend of an activist who was convicted in 2008 of financing the terrorist organization Hamas. In an interview with the Daily Caller, Mohammed El-Biari, a member of the Homeland Security Advisory Council, reiterated claims he made this summer that former Holy Land Foundation president and CEO Shukri Abu Baker is innocent and a victim of political persecution. El-Biari, who is in his position on the council, has regular access to classified information, also said the United States insults Muslim dignity and compared the Muslim Brotherhood to American evangelicals. El-Biari confirmed to journalist Ryan Morrow of the Clarion Project in August that he is a longtime friend of Baker. Morrow interview can be read at the Center for Security Policy. Baker and 4 other officials of the closed Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development were convicted of using the charity to finance Hamas in 2008. It was the largest terrorism financing trial in U.S. history. Federal prosecutors described the foundation, which was closed by the U.S. government in 2001, as an entity of the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood. El-Biari first disclosed the relationship in a 2007 article in the Dallas Morning News. He met Baker as a teenager and was so moved by the terrorist funder's explanation of alleged Israeli persecution of Palestinians that he says he began donating monthly to Baker's foundation until it closed in 2001. The friendship continued with El-Biari meeting with Baker for coffee the day before he was convicted. El-Biari maintains that Baker is innocent, and in 2010 he wrote that the U.S. government was, quote, using the law to force compliance with unjust foreign policies, unquote. He reiterated his belief that the U.S. should not have prosecuted the Holy Land Foundation. The Muslim activist has never disguised his support for Muslim Brotherhood extremism. In a 2006 letter to the Morning News, he defended the fanatically anti-American early Brotherhood leader and theorist Saeed Qutb, stating, "I'd recommend everyone read Qutb, but read him with an eye to improving America, not just to be jealous with malice in our hearts." Let me insert here. Qutb wrote in Egypt a book called Milestones that a guy named Osama bin Laden gives a great deal of credit for radicalizing him. And here we have someone that Janet Napolitano handpicked to be at the highest advisory council level, have access to classified material, somebody that thinks the guy that radicalized Osama bin Laden is somebody we all should read with an eye toward improving America. El-Biari has been honored by the FBI Society of Former Special Agents, the article says. And again, parenthetically here, it's not in the article, but we also know that the FBI continued a relationship with CAIR, even knowing that they had gathered evidence that showed that CAIR was a large Muslim Brotherhood front organization, which was supportive of the Holy Land Foundation. Even knowing those things, even knowing that it was implicated as a named co-conspirator in that trial, amazingly, it took until 2008 and 2009 for the FBI to suspend their partnership with CAIR, and we know that CAIR continued until they changed their name here recently in the last few weeks to WTF. They continue to complain, have instant access to anyone in this administration. They help get the FBI training materials purged of anything that might be offensive to someone who was a radical Islamist. But the article says in September, El-Biari was promoted to senior advisor at the Advisory Council, a title held only by select members. Other council members include William Bratton, the revered former New York Police Commissioner, Los Angeles Chief of Police, former CIA Director Bill Webster, L.A. County Sheriff Lee Baca. And we have this, it's been tweeted out. I'm honored to be reappointed to Secretary of Homeland Security Advisory Council and promoted to senior fellow position. That's Mohammed El-Biari. This article says, have you ever wondered why the Obama administration believes that the Muslim Brotherhood is a moderate force for good and partners with known U.S. Muslim Brotherhood entities? This interview with Mr. El-Biari helps us find an answer, Morrow said. El-Biari received national attention in June 2012 when Minnesota Republican Michelle Bachmann and 4 other members of Congress, one including me, wrote a letter to the Department of Homeland Security naming him as one of 3 advisors with extensive ties to the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist organizations and causes. Anyway, it's just amazing. And it was also amazing that when I confronted Secretary Napolitano in a hearing about the fact that Mr. El-Biari had accessed classified material, and I was told by the director of the Department of Public Safety, Steve McCraw in Texas, he had spoken with her chief of staff. He had confirmed that he had briefed her totally on what Mr. El-Biari had done, and they would be looking into it. When I asked her about it the next day after her chief of staff had said she had been totally briefed, she looked me in the eye and said she didn't know anything about it, but she did say she would investigate. We now know from a Freedom of Information answer from Department of Homeland Security, they never investigated. Even when you had a writer, a journalist, Patrick Poole, wrote a story stating that Mr. El-Biari had actually shopped 2 documents that they knew he had downloaded from the classified website. He had shopped it to a national media, and Mr. Poole confirmed to me that they have never once asked him about his sources, and we then had it confirmed from the FOIA request that actually they never did an investigation. Instead, they just promoted him. It is incredible. But then again, when you look at what this administration is doing to those who don't necessarily worship Allah but worship God and believe in God and have served the country, this administration making it tough. One of our most revered monuments, Mount Rushmore. Well, I was quoted accurately in the media over a week ago saying after shutting down these open-air monuments, just sidewalks you can roll around in a disabled veteran's wheelchair, what are they going to do next? Put drapery over the Mount Rushmore? Well, it turned out what they did. I guess I shouldn't have said anything because maybe it was the power of suggestion. Oh, there's a way we can make people miserable. Even though it's a state road built by the state of South Dakota, maintained by the state of South Dakota, patrolled by the state of South Dakota, we had federal authorities go put cones and barricades to prevent people from being able to pull off to the side of the road to even take pictures of Mount Rushmore. Somebody, while the government was shut down, sent enough park rangers out to put up massive numbers of cones to try to make life as difficult as possible simply for people who loved America, who just wanted to pull over and get a view of Mount Rushmore. They weren't going to patrol it. South Dakota does that. When South Dakota, dear friend Christy Noem, she said when South Dakota had pointed out, hey, this is a state road, the federal authority said, oh no, but this is on federal land and we're not letting anybody pull over. So this is what you get. This is the way Americans are treated unless you're going to be illegally in the country and have a protest. Then we'll give you permits, whatever you want. I was gratified to hear our friend Representative Noem point out to us that though sad that South Dakota had 4 feet of snow in some places, unfortunately that covered all the barricades and cones. So strictly in the interest of safety, South Dakota had to send their snow plows and wipe all the snow, and there was no way to sort out the cones and barricades, so apparently they're in some ditch somewhere. But for safety purposes, because they were just trying to help those South Dakotans and Americans that wanted to see Mount Rushmore get through that road, that state-built road. So anyway, another chance to make Americans miserable, but Mother Nature came through, followed by South Dakota making things safe. Here's one. This is out by the Moore Farm that hadn't gotten a dime of federal money since 1980. Former park director, National Park Service employee is director, been a director for 32 years. They barely make it, but they've lost $15,000 to $20,000 just by being closed down. They rented barricades to take out there and close down a colonial farm from the 1700s. And as a result of this mean-spirited action by an administration, This farm may close down for good. They're running out of money. But I have a dear friend that has arrived on the floor, and I would certainly yield to him for such time as he may consume. Mr. LaMoffett.
Well, I appreciate my colleague, Mr. Gohmert, here on pointing out the really the hypocrisy of what's going on with the public's lands, the public's parks, the way this is being used as leverage by the folks higher up in this administration to try and extract from the American people, from those of us in this House perhaps, what they want. So, you know, we heard, he mentioned the thing in South Dakota there. Now, there's a lot of suffering going on in South Dakota right there, where a lot of ranchers have lost a lot of livestock. And if anything, if our government has the ability to do something, it should be finding ways to help people instead of putting up cones where they aren't supposed to be on a state highway they claim is on federal land. And so if all those cones are in the bottom of a canyon that they may have had to rent or what have you, similar to the barricades that they're putting up around the monuments and memorials here in this town, where they have to go out and rent barricades on company time with furloughed employees even to set them up and put sandbags in place. This is an insult to the American people. It's an insult to all of our honor flight folks that have been coming into town. Anybody would use what would normally be 24-hour memorials, 24-hour monuments. So what gives? I don't understand. You know, getting to the bottom of this here, we have this impasse in the Congress here in Washington. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, it's about time this has ended, because we're hurting the American people by the actions of this White House, by the impasse, the Senate. We've sent over various either all-inclusive CRs or the bits and pieces we're doing to try and fund things as a priority one at a time that are very important to the American people. Funding our veterans, funding the basic ability when we've had fallen soldiers come home here in this recent news story, that their families can't even go pick them up because of an unyieldingness by this administration, by those in the various bureaucracies, to instead work to help American people in a time of fiscal straits that we're in, to help as much as possible. They're looking for ways to instead hurt them as much as possible. What is with this? We can even go back to previous impasses where at least President Clinton would sit down with a Republican House, a Republican Senate, or after a while it was a Republican House and Democrat-controlled Senate. There's been a mixture over time of putting aside the bitter partisanship and figuring out how we're going to hammer this out. If we can do it with President Clinton, we can do it in previous presidencies. This isn't the first time there's been this kind of impasse or this type of slowdown or shutdown. Yet this time seems to be unique in the meanness and the bitterness that's coming down from the intractability at the White House level and over on the Senate side as we put forward solution after solution.
Well, and reclaim my time just momentarily.
Certainly.
It's also worth noting that here in the House, we've actually had numerous Democrats vote with us. So the only really bipartisan thing that's been going on in this whole Capitol are our bills to fund certain parts of the government. I yield to my friend.
Thank you. Yes, we've had unanimous votes go out off this floor with nearly 200 Democrats joining us on two of the pieces of legislation, and anywhere from 25 to 35 to 40 on many of the other pieces that have gone out. So it's been a bipartisan effort. I think both sides of the aisle see this as really a nonpartisan issue on these issues we're working on. And so why do they have to rest on Senator Reid's desk over on the Senate side? Why do we get threats of vetoes from the White House when we find agreement? We would find agreement on almost the entire CR if we got that one provision there where even some of the senators themselves, and now we're seeing it in the press, where I think you're going to mention Wolf Blitzer, has now joined with Senator Manchin as well as Senator Baucus, and thinking this is the Obama health care takeover is a train wreck, that we're seeing a pretty diverse group of people saying, you know, a one-year delay would not be an unreasonable thing. As we're seeing the exchanges rolling out, they're not working very well. And people, when they're looking finally to find out what the prices are, what it's going to cost them, maybe people thought they were going to get it for free, they're going to get a rebate, they're going to get a lower price. A lot of Americans, especially the youth, are going to see higher prices. They're not going to see the savings. And if you look at the track record of the government operating things, government generally doesn't do things cheaper. And we're going to learn this in a very detrimental way to our economy, to the health care for the people of this country, as this Obama health care takeover continues to roll out.
Well, and I'm sure that Mr. Moffett has had people ask, as I've had, now, why in the world is Obamacare costing so dramatically much more than the health insurance we had before, and then when we get notified, we're actually getting less health care? And my friend mentioned Wolf Blitzer, this article in National Review Online, quoted him as saying, if they weren't fully ready, talking about the websites, Obamacare websites, they should accept the advice that a lot of Republicans are giving them, delay it another year, get it ready, make sure it works. They know how to do it, but if they didn't get it ready on time, then maybe fix the problem and make sure people don't have to worry about it. But we come back, it's a disaster. It's more expensive than people's health care was before. They're getting less health care. They're not keeping their doctor. And it sounds like an awful lot of Americans are not keeping the policy they have. So why is it costing so much more? And what people that don't know need to understand, when you hire thousands and thousands of people who don't provide health care to be navigators through the health care system, and you hire 18,000 or so more IRS officers to go through every detail of people's personal, financial, and personal life, and they don't provide any health care. They may cause some health problems, but they don't provide any health care. You add all this bureaucracy, it's going to cost more, and you're going to get less treatment, and it's not going to be as good a treatment. I yield back to Mr. Lamothe.
Exactly. Now, who are the navigators? Weren't they supposed to be vetted as to who they are, go through security? And as well, look at the track record of the IRS. The American people really want 18,000 or so IRS individuals helping with their important personal health data. I mean, there's been laws passed to make sure that that's a very secure thing, sometimes even inconvenient to the patient, where you might be at the doctor say, well, don't you already have this information from my other doctor? There's very strict guidelines on how your information is traded around. Now it's going to be in the hands of navigators that are unvetted and with IRS agents that have some very huge security issues already with the way that's being used against certain organizations.
Well,
so
and there's a story today from Daily Caller about the White House IRS exchanged confidential taxpayer information by Patrick Howley. So if you think your personal information is secure with the IRS or with the federal government, it's already showing you should not be comfortable with it happening. Yield, my friend.
Then the most outrageous thing for most folks, though, is that the waivers. Many individuals in this country are asked for and got to be outside of this as it was coming together. And more are asking for it. Some are being turned down. But especially, I guess, buying off members of Congress through the OPM, allowing Congress and Capitol Hill to be exempt from this. If it's such a great program, if it's going to work so well, why would we be subject to a waiver? Why are they talking about there'd be a brain drain on Capitol Hill because everybody would be leaving because they can't afford the health insurance? How does that work?
Well, apparently our time is expiring, and I appreciate so much my friend Mr. Lamothe for helping.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Gohmert.
We should not be treated any differently. The President and his family need to sign up. But, Mr. Speaker, I think it's worth noting that when I went out to the U.S. Marine Corps War Memorial, the Iwo Jima Memorial, this administration had tried to prevent World War II veterans from getting to the symbol of Mount Suribachi, and there were 3 busloads of World War II vets up there at the memorial, and the barricade was in pieces. God bless our World War II veterans. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
This time I move that we do now hereby adjourn.
Questions on the motion adjourned? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
And the House is done for the day. They passed a bill today partially funding the Federal Aviation Administration, one of the so-called